presentation.
Jose, thank you very much. It was. I'm going to ask you a few questions about that presentation now and see if you can add to that. The first thing that should strike the viewers is probably something surprising to them, that yes, pandemics obviously increase the mortality rates, and we can discuss that. And the Spanish flu example you give was a dramatic example of that. But the interesting thing you've added to that is that if people think that slumps and recessions will increase mortality rates, all your empirical evidence shows that's not the case. And indeed, in periods of boom, there can be an increase in mortality rate. So the first question I would ask you is, why is it that recessions don't produce higher mortality rates? And why is it that some evidence shows that in booms we do get higher mortality rates?
Well, there is a variety of reasons for that. Some of them are very clear, others are not so clear. For instance, in modern societies, traffic is an important cause of death. Many people are killed by car crashes or pedestrians run down by a truck or whatever. And you know that this is strongly connected with the conditions of the economy, because in periods of expansion, there is much more traffic, more cars are moving around with people going to work, people visiting friends, sales representatives moving around, more trucks are moving goods around, and all this increases the volume of traffic. And when there is a recession, all this goes in the opposite direction. Less cars, less trucks, and this strongly reduces the number of people that is killed because of traffic injuries. Now, traffic injuries are a small proportion of total mortality. It's not the main cause of that at all. What is the main cause of death in modern societies is cardiovascular disease, diseases of the heart and the circulatory system. Well, there is strong evidence that the mortality rate because of diseases of the circulatory system or the heart attacks or strokes or all that increases when the economy is in an expansion. Why could be that? Well, there are a number of reasons. One is that people are more stressed. During periods of expansion, often people are doing overwork. Firms demand overtime of workers, and it often happens that workers are sleeping less when there is a period of booming economy. This reverses when there is a recession. The average working time tend to be higher in periods of expansion or recession. Another that could be a reason why mortality rates because of cardiovascular disease increase a little bit during periods of expansion and decrease in recession. Another possibility is that there is an impact of atmospheric pollution, because in periods of economic expansion, there is much more industrial activity and traffic. The atmosphere has much more pollution in terms of particulate matter and other pollutants like ozone or NO2, whatever. And it is clear that these pollutants have an effect on cardiovascular mortality. There is a lot of evidence that comparing days with low atmospheric pollution with days of high atmospheric pollution, the number of hospitalizations and deaths because of cardiovascular disease are connected with the level of atmospheric pollution. So this could be a reason to explain why when there is a recession and atmospheric pollution is reduced, the mortality rate because of cardiovascular disease also goes down. Of course, what I said about cardiovascular disease is very much applicable to diseases because of respiratory disease. I mean, deaths because of respiratory disease, because respiratory disease, chronic bronchitis and lung disease is a major cause of death, and this is connected with atmospheric pollution. When there is more atmospheric pollution, people who have a chronic respiratory disease tend to get worse and can die. So all this would be potential reasons to explain why during recessions mortality rates overall tend to decrease. There is an exception in this, which is suicides. Suicides tend to increase in recessions. That's correct. But suicides are quite a small part of total mortality, about less than 10%, and the increase in mortality because other causes of death much more than compensate, but that overcome the increase in suicides. So these are the major reasons that could be argued. In a recent paper, I look at how periods of expansion and recession impact on some health variables, like for instance, blood pressure. And it is interesting that blood pressure tends to increase slightly when the economy accelerates. So about if the unemployment rate goes down by 1 percentage point, blood pressure tends to go up by about 1 millimeter of mercury.
Right.
So, of course, this looks like tiny, but high blood pressure is one important predictor of cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular death. And this increase I was talking about is a population increase. So with a slight increase in blood pressure, it could be translated in an important increase in cardiovascular disease deaths. Well, I don't know. Yeah, that's what I can say now.
All the things you said there, Jose, are really important, because they're obviously contrarian in many ways to what people think. And you've given evidence to show why that you're likely to have a lower level of mortality rate during recessions than you are in booms. And given that we're in this COVID-19 crisis at the moment, which has seen a sharp increase in deaths, and I just wanted to show you a few graphs that I've got, which exhibit that, and also relate to the question of what the lockdown has meant for other sorts of deaths and the implications for air pollution and the environment. So if I just pick up my graphs, if I can, so if you see this graph, just to kick off, I just had a few graphs here. I looked at, Jose, I looked at excess deaths over the normal historical average at the moment for various countries during the COVID pandemic at the moment. And as you can see, a considerable number of countries have got a much higher level of excess deaths compared to the historic average. The UK is unhappily leading this race in the league table with 67,000 more deaths and a 54% higher level of deaths compared to the historical average. And it runs down in various countries. The US, for example, has 24,000 more deaths on average. It's a big country, so we'll see how that works out. But that's 52% more, sorry, the other way around, 52,000 deaths and 24% increase over the excess. So that's an indication of how important pandemics are in hitting the mortality rate, a point you made about the Spanish flu. And I'm going to ask you a question about relation of the COVID-19 to the Spanish flu in a moment. But also, if we look at what's happening to emissions, there's been quite a lot of talk about the fact that because of the lockdown, the stopping of factories, movement of transport and travel and so on, we're going to see a sharp fall in CO2 emissions this year. The estimate has been put between 4 and 8%. That's the 2020 forecast on the right there, on the billions of tons of CO2 per year. At least in 2020, we're going to see, thankfully, a fall in that figure as a result of the lockdown. And the IEA says that because we're using 6% less energy this year on that, they suspect emissions could fall by that sort of level of 3 billion tons of warming gas, 6 times larger than we had in the last global recession. So this is a much more bigger impact on the climate and on the global emissions, at least for this year. Electricity demand down by 20%, and over the full year, maybe 5%, the biggest drop since the 1930s. Global coal demand is also set to fall by 8%. And as you pointed out, the importance of one of the factors on road transport activity is down 50% at the end of March, and the use of jet fuel is down by 65% at the moment, which is an indication all these factors on energy, fossil fuel, and carbon emissions are reduced. But of course, it doesn't mean that climate change is resolved or global warming is resolved, because we are already way, way above the level that we should be for the minimum requirement of a temperature rise of 1.5%, 1.5 centigrade increase, and that we're nowhere near reducing global emissions at this moment. Even with this fall that we might get in this year, it's going to take a lot more than we've seen up to now in terms of dealing with fossil fuel industry. Carbon emissions, the drop that followed the recession in 2009 was only 6%. The COVID-19 could see a drop, as I say, between 4 and 8%, but we need every year 5% reduction in net zero emissions until we get down to net zero emissions by 2015. At the moment, that doesn't seem very likely. So my conclusion and question that I put to you now is we've got a reduction. The COVID pandemic is definitely increasing the number of deaths we get historically, not at the level of the Spanish 1918 to 2019 flu epidemic, or pandemic, as you showed, would kill millions, if not hundreds of millions. Is the reason for the difference between the level of deaths we've seen so far in the coronavirus crisis due to the policies of a more effective containment than we saw in the Spanish flu epidemic? Was there any containment at all? Was it just allowed to run riot in 1918-20? Because either some governments have been able to introduce contact and trace, have a decent health system to control and absorb such cases that appear, and other governments, when they don't, have just introduced either draconian lockdowns of various degrees, which have enabled the containment to operate and keep the level of mortality down. Because if you have a 1% fatality rate, which is what a lot of people think COVID will end up being, and you have, say, 60 or 70% of the population gets it in the end, you'd be talking more like 40 to 50 million people dying, rather than just 300 to 350,000 as we have at the moment. And then the other question I'm going to ask you, Jose, is about the question of carbon emissions reduction. It's good news the lockdown has reduced carbon emissions, but this is, in your opinion, probably just a temporary situation as we restore the economy over the next few years.
Well, on the comparison of the present pandemic and the 1980 flu pandemic, by the way, I always criticize the term Spanish flu because it's bad. It was not the Spanish. It is unclear where it started, probably in France, but it is unclear. But what is clear is that it didn't start in Spain.
Yes.
So, but anyway,
that was because it was actually the only place that had any peace at the time, wasn't it? That's
because there was no participation of Spain in World War I. There was no military censoring of news, and so the cases of flu started to be reported first in Spain, but for weeks or months, this flu had been hitting the soldiers in the trenches in the front, in the Eastern Front, and killing French and British and German soldiers. So anyway, that flu lasted about 2 years. It had several waves, and estimates of the burden of death caused by that pandemic are between 50 and 100 millions worldwide.
Wow.
For instance, in the United States, it is estimated that it costs between 500,000 and 750,000 deaths. Of course, at the time, the population of the world was much smaller than now. So about a fourth of the present population. So if the mortality rate caused by the present pandemic was similar to that caused by the 1918 pandemic, we could expect 4 times more deaths. That would be between 200 and 400 million.
Wow.
Which is a lot of people. So in a sense, if mortality is much below that, we could be interpreting it as a victory of science and public health. Because to tell the truth, in terms of medicine, in terms of treatment, today we have almost as little treatment for the disease as it was 1 century ago. So what it is being done now is to use measures to avoid contagion that basically were not used or used very little in the flu pandemic of 1918. Because of course, at the time, there was a lot of confusion about what was the cause of the disease. Many scientists thought it was caused by a bacteria, Haemophilus influenza. That was wrong, of course. Nothing was known about the flu virus. There was not a flu, there was not any vaccine, though there were several ones that were not effective but were used anyway. So there were many things that were different. What is clear is that unfortunately, the present pandemic is still going on. We have no idea how long this is going to last. And well, presently estimates of world deaths are around 300,000, of which about a third are in the United States, which is quite remarkable, by the way, because of course the United States is much less than 1/3 of the world population. But anyway, still this is going on. I am afraid that this pandemic can have a very, very heavy impact on the population of countries in Africa and Asia and Latin America. I am afraid that the impact of this epidemic can be very fearful in countries like India, Indonesia, Brazil, and that could represent million deaths. But I don't know. Let's hope I am wrong, and let's hope that measures to stop the pandemic are used to avoid this terrible burden of death. Now, moving to the other question you asked about carbon emissions, it is obvious that they are falling. Carbon emissions are connected strongly with economic activity. So when the economic activity slows down or is completely ceased, as has been in many sectors of the economy in the past 2 months, well, emissions go down. The same as pollution goes down. So
tell me, is that sort of a proof that global warming is man-made, if it's affected by the movement of the industrial cycle?
That is well, global warming is it has a dynamic that goes in the long run. So what is obvious that is impacted by the business cycle of expansion and recession is emissions of CO2. That is very clear. Every time there is a recession, emissions go down, and this is good both for national economies of or the global economy. So now, unfortunately, I am afraid that as soon as the pandemic start to slow down, well, emissions will rise very quickly again, because as soon as economic activity is started again, emissions start to go up again, and there is nothing to suggest that this is going to change. So let's see how things go. The question is that it's unclear how quickly the economy will recover, even if the lockdown is completely ceased or partially ceased. The economy can take a while to recover. Many people are thinking that there will not be a quick recovery. And there is another possibility, is that when the lockdown start to be removed, that can open a new wave of the pandemic, and that could force to further lockdowns. And so this can have unexpected effects on the conditions of the economy. And I am really uncertain of what can be the condition of the economy of any country in particular, or the world in general, say 6 months from today. It's very, very uncertain. So that's what I can say.
Can I ask you, perhaps maybe again towards the end of this, could the lockdowns have been avoided? Many people have a different view on this, that maybe we shouldn't have had lockdowns, it's ruined the economy. What we should have done was simply lock up the old people who were most subject to it, as you pointed out, mostly the elderly, and we should have allowed the infection to take place amongst all the under 50s and young people who apparently not many of them get severely ill from this, and we reach a level of immunity which enables the virus to wane and disappear. Taking into account the experience of the Spanish flu, for example, was that a viable alternative to these lockdowns?
Well, I believe there is still a lot of uncertainty about that. I believe we need the pandemic to pass and be able to compare how the pandemic has evolved in different countries that have applied different policies, if not totally different, at least slightly different, and then we will see. What I believe, it is clear that some public health experts that at the start of the epidemic we are saying, well, we shall be more prudent. It is unclear that introducing a lockdown is going to be favorable to dampen the expansion of the pandemic. Well, these people mostly have been shown to be wrong. At the end, most experts in public health acknowledge that it was important to dampen the pandemic by asking people not to go out and closing the places where there is a possibility of transmission of the virus, and so on and so forth. But I still think that it is unclear would have been the best policy. I tend to believe that there is already, if not definite, relatively strong evidence that these policies of social distancing are good to dampen the pandemics, and they are probably saving a lot of lives. Now, we cannot be sure how long the pandemic is going to last. A possibility is that these policies are just distributing deaths in time. So if you have 3 years with 20 million deaths per year, that is exactly the same as if you have 1 year with 60 million deaths. You know what I mean? So at the time, there is uncertainty of a number of things. I have some background in public health, but I am not into the field right now. So I can just look at what experts say, and I think that most experts are in agreement that social distancing measures have been effective, and now there is a lot of concern on removing these policies perhaps too soon in some parts, as some states of the United States are already doing. So let's see what's happening. As I say, there is a lot of uncertainty on many things.
Jose, what seems to me is that the reason for flattening or dampening the impact to begin with was because health systems really weren't able to cope if they got an extreme increase in cases straight into the hospitals. It would have overloaded the hospital system. It means other people who've got serious illnesses wouldn't be treated either. So it could have really been a disaster in terms of mortality and severe cases. That's why the attempt for lockdowns or some forms of strict containment and social distancing have been proved necessary. But the question I'd probably ask you is that, as you say, we don't know whether that's going to achieve an end to this virus. Would, in your opinion, a vaccine be a solution? Or given that influenza vaccines only work about 50% effectively anyway, maybe even a vaccine won't be enough to bring an end to this pandemic?
Well, if there is a vaccine, and this vaccine has at least moderate or high level of efficacy in terms of protecting a large proportion of those who receive the vaccine from infection, well, that could be a major step to solve this. I believe this is now very important. The question is that the vaccine will take a while. Let's hope that it doesn't happen like in 1918, that there were vaccines, but they were all ineffective. None of them was useful. And there were 3 or 4 vaccines around, but they were all useless. So let's hope that something is developed soon and is available. The other thing will be if there is a vaccine and is effective, how is that going to be applied? Unfortunately, the present situation in the world, with all this nationalism and governments trying to protect their own population and don't giving a dime for the rest of the world, is not good. That this is not promoting world cooperation when it's more needed. So prospects are not good for that. But what can we do?
Well, I think, just to finish, I'll just try and sum up a few points, see if you agree with them. That what you've told us is that pandemics like the Spanish flu and this one dramatically increase mortality rates, much more than some people argue would happen if we had a deep slump, as we're now entering in most economies, at least for several quarters ahead, maybe longer. That recessions don't produce higher mortality rates for the reasons you presented during your presentation, and that's one area we should be well aware of. And also the question of whether you need some sort of containment and lockdowns in order to reduce the impact of this pandemic so that it's not cornered into one small area, is second, showing that we did have to use some measures of social distancing of varying degrees in order to try and control the speed and rapidity of this contagion of this pandemic. And also, we haven't got to the end of it, and we still don't know whether there's going to be any sort of medical opportunity through a vaccine and other things to achieve that, particularly as there's no international coordination whatsoever, really. The World Health Organization, which supposedly provides at least an agency for coordination, has been more or less ripped apart by the United States, amongst others, because of its supposed connection with China. So that's generally what I see, but is there anything you think we should add to that before we finish?
Well, I don't know. I believe it's important to be conscious that we are in a quite different historical situation to any other time in recent decades. The only similar thing is the pandemic of 1918, but it was a completely different world. The pandemic was also different. The population of the world was much smaller. And now we have a globalized economy. We have very powerful means of destruction. And I don't know, it's a completely different situation. And I would like to think that the human race will be reacting to this better than reacted to the pandemic of 1918, so that we will avoid a terrible burden of death. So for that reason, it's important to pay attention to all these things, numbers. Unfortunately, often in looking at economic issues, it is only the shorter term that is looked at. I need to open my business. I need to do this and that very soon. But the problem is that here we are in a situation in which all these decisions can have major impacts on the number of deaths that finally account, and that is an important consideration. So that is what I would like to say.
Well, thank you very much, Jose. I'm just reminded myself too about the Spanish flu epidemic or pandemic, that my great-grandfather died in that pandemic, leaving a mother and 3 children, my grandmother, my mother. So, so it has an impact on people's lives going through generations as a result of these terrible events that take place. And certainly people are suffering from that now already, for the number of, even if we've only had a very small number of deaths compared to what we had in 1918, more to come, unfortunately. So it's an issue which is not, as you say, is completely unknown. The word unprecedented gets used, and I'm afraid it's used a little bit more sensibly on this one, that this is such a completely new situation that the world economy and humanity faces. And as you say, we can only hope that we can deal with it, both through the health systems that we have, the people involved in them, and also through our governments and so on, that will come forward with policies which will get us through this crisis and take humanity forward in a more harmonious and well-developed way. That's still to come. So I'd like to thank Dr. Tapia, Jose Tapia, for talking to me today about these issues, and there'll be further discussions on different subjects coming up over the next month or two. When you get this, you'll be able to see Jose's website and information about him, so that if you want to get his papers and his books and so on, you'll be able to follow that up later on, and I certainly recommend that you do so, especially his book on the recession with Rolando Astarita, and also his chapter in our book that we edited, myself and Mina Kokedi, an excellent chapter by Dr. Tapia on profits and investment and crises, which everybody should have the opportunity to read. I think we've learned a lot from that. So thanks again, Jose, and see you soon.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you for organizing this. Bye.